Hi, Dr. Lou here to talk about tabletop games for exactly 7 players and the difficulties involved in creating that. It's an unusual goal. In role-playing games, you can accommodate 7 fairly easily. But how many tabletop hobby games can you think of that adequately accommodate 7 players? They're more likely to be card than board games, certainly. The modern tendency is to sell games for 2 to 4 or 3 to 4 players, or even 1 to 4, and then add players up to 6 in expansions. So, can you think of any game that requires exactly 7? Well, that game is Diplomacy, and there are probably more that I haven't thought of. I've also made a screencast about the effects of varying the number of players in a game, but that's a different topic. So, what can prevent using 7 players? Well, there can be component limitations, board limitations if it's a board game, downtime can be a problem, and the game can become too complex if you have so many players. Component limitations first. You could play Risk with 7 if you add components. They're provided for 6. Diplomacy, of course, is for 7. But components cost money, which raises the price. Publishers are reluctant to include components for more than 5. Even if you provide components for only 5, can the game be played by 7 if players provide the components, or put 2 copies of the game together? Sometimes not. And a reason not can be board limitations. And this applies, of course, in games of maneuver and geospatial relationships, real board games that require a board as opposed to board games that are using a board to keep track of status, other kinds of status. So a board large enough for 4 or even 5 may not be large enough for more. Yet if you make the board large enough for 6 or 7, often that makes it too large for 3 or 4. Which number is more likely to play? The lower numbers. I have 2 prototype games that I'm going to show you the maps of, where the board can accommodate up to 5, and I have made larger boards for 6 or 7. If published, the game may only have components for 5, and somebody has to provide the components, and the plan is to have the second board on the opposite side, just as in my Dragon Rage, where there's boards on both sides, or the latest version of Britannia, where there are boards on both sides. One of these games is called Dominance of the Old World, and the 2 boards are physically the same size, but the Southeast Asia board has a lot more areas. The Europe board is the smaller one. The other is a science fiction empires game, Pleiades Cluster. Again, the same size physically for the boards, but the Galaxy board has a lot more connectivity points, which is to say, playable locations. Now, Diplomacy is the opposite if you think about it. A board made for 7 that doesn't work well for fewer players, and that's partly because it's semi-historical. My 2 games are not. So here are the dominance boards. The one for up to 5 players on the left, and the one for 6 or 7, you could play it with 5, on the right. And that one on the right is a very interesting board because of all the sea spaces, but of course Europe has a lot of sea as well. Then the Pleiades boards, the board for up to 5 is the Pleiades cluster, and it doesn't work as for 6. Somebody gets squeezed out. So I made a board for 6 or 7 players, and presumably you could play with 8 or even 9 if you provided the components, but it's only been played by 7. And that's a galaxy with a satellite galaxy. But downtime is going to be a problem in any case in turn-based games. Perhaps even not turn-based games, anything but simultaneous play. The other players have to wait while one player is doing whatever he's doing. Now, traditionally, downtime is thinking time, but there are so many games that require little thinking these days that the players no longer think about the game. And in the 21st century, gamers have so much less patience. Furthermore, the zeitgeist is to not bother to plan, and cell phones have done a great deal to contribute to that. You don't have to plan, you can just get on your cell phone and find out what you want to find out. So in turn-based games without much chance of interrupts, that is, players playing out a turn, the downtime increases with the number of players. So a 7-player version might work mechanically, but not so well psychologically. For example, another of my prototypes, Eurasia, can be played by 7, but it's a lot of downtime sometimes. As you add players, a game often becomes more complex and decisions are harder to make. And the whole thrust of games these days is to provide for fewer decisions for the players. So a game with an ideal level of complexity at 4 players might be too much at 7 for the same target market. It depends on the game. I'm also making a video about games for more than 7, but those are very different. Thanks for listening.